if the players are good, if the players have performed well, there will be a market for them. There's a second issue, and I think you raised this validly here, Joe. Manchester United are generous payers. They've now got, I think, the third highest wage bill in the Premier League. And let's be brutal. If they'd won a few more competitions, if they'd qualified for Europe last year, their wage bill would have been much higher.
Hello and welcome to Stretford Paddock. My name is Joe and we are joined once again by friend of the channel, University of Liverpool football finance lecturer and football finance expert, Kieran Maguire. Kieran, great to have you back on the channel. How are you doing?
I'm good, Joe. Football season's over. Football finance season never stops. So it's still 365 days a year of fun.
Well, if anything, it's almost feel like as though the finances are one of the main things that gets talked about this time of year, because everyone's trying to balance who they can buy, how they can buy them, who they need to sell, all of this sort of thing. So obviously, let's get started with Manchester United, because I'm going to ask you all the questions that I'm sure you're expecting. The first one is a general overview. Man United's financial picture. I feel like up until maybe a month or two ago, the idea that was being painted and sort of pervading through the United fan base was Manchester United are skint, we'll have no money in the summer, it's the worst things have ever been. Our own owner has come out and said we would have been bust by Christmas if it weren't for these redundancies. And yet now the transfer window opens, we see these articles in The Athletic, we see United throwing cash around, and all of a sudden it looks as though maybe United's financial picture is a bit better than expected. What is going on with United's sort of financial kind of stability and sort of, I don't want to say profits, but United's potential in the transfer window at the moment?
United are fine. I mean, can they spend unlimited amounts of money? No. Can they drop 150 million? Yes, they can. And they clearly they've made a start to that. People who criticise the club, but they forget this is Manchester United. It's one of the biggest global sporting brands on the planet, and therefore, when the results came out last week, I think people were taken aback. The losses are substantially down compared to the same period last year, which is encouraging. I think you've got to look at the reasons behind that, and those are perhaps a little bit more mixed. But the club's still got plenty of cash in the bank. Yes, it's got debts as well, but those debts don't need to be repaid for a few years. It's a bit like if I looked at my personal finances, I've got the cash in the bank and then I've got my mortgage. It looks grim. But then I forget, well, I've got a house as well. It's the same with Manchester United. They've got Carrington, they've got OT, they've got all of this investment in players. So the money has been spent. You can argue about how well the money's been spent on players, but that's for another podcast. So they're okay. If we take a look at sort of the detailed figures, the money generated for the first 9 months of the year, it was a wee bit down on 23-24, but that's due to the fact that they're not in the Champions League. And the way that it works is that for every pound you make in the Europa League, you'll probably make about four and a half in the Champions League. So there is going to be a big difference, and it's clearly Champions League or nowhere as far as clubs are concerned. And Manchester United now have the opportunity to get into the Champions League next season, and that's the way I think you've got to be positive, and to say, okay, there's less European distractions, which means that there's pure focus now on Premier League success, and that's a positive. As far as the wages are concerned, the wages are down quite considerably compared to last year. Have the redundancies made a difference? I'll be honest. Not much of a difference. If you're getting rid of people on 30 or 40 grand a pop, there's got to be a lot of those to go. And I appreciate a lot of people have lost their jobs. But Marcus Rashford, his wages not being paid. Jadon Sancho, Anthony, you're looking at a combined wage bill there of what, 700-800 grand a week. You spread that over a quarter, over 3 months. That's a saving of £10 million. Some of that will have come back because I know United were paying a proportion of the wages, but that's all positives. Interest rates or exchange rates, they've been in Manchester United's benefit. So overall, a solid set of results. At the same time, still not making money, but losing far less.
Well, that's a decent thing. Like you said about the redundancies, if you think someone's on 30, let's say 33 grand a year, for them to save as much money as someone that's on 100 grand a week, they'd have to get rid of 150 people. Is that right? Like, that is amazing, isn't it?
Right.
You think 100 grand a week isn't even that much for a Premier League footballer these days. And yet 33 grand a year, which is pretty much the average wage in the UK, maybe even slightly above in Manchester, 150 people would have to lose their jobs to match just 100 grand a week footballer. It's amazing that you see the disparity in what people are earning when it does come to these redundancies and having to save money this way. Just on a second point on these finances. In the last few days, I mean, I guess you will have known this for a while, but I think it came to sort of public attention over the last week or two that United, and a bit more of the structure about how United actually pay this money and where the debts actually are at Manchester United, because there's a lot of different companies and branches and offshoots and shell companies, or whatever you want to call it, subsidiaries within what we think of as Manchester United. So talk to me about the difference between the different companies that we have and the different debt and what they owe that is different, that means we can spend money here, but on this company we've lost a lot more money, kind of thing, because it's all a little bit confusing to someone like me who doesn't really have much of any financial knowledge at all.
Yeah, okay. So we've got what we might refer to as the mothership, that is Manchester United PLC. Now, that company is registered in the Cayman Islands and it trades its shares in New York. And we saw the share price react to the financial results last week. The value of Manchester United on the stock exchange went up by 300 million, and it's gone up by more since then, since certainly when I last looked. So the stock market liked those results. But as far as the Premier League is concerned, for PSR purposes, you can't use an overseas company. The company has got to be registered in the UK. So therefore, there's a company called Red Football, and it looks as if that company, and Manchester United won't give a straight answer, and the Premier League won't give a straight answer to this, which is frustrating and annoying, but it's a private matter at the end of the day between the two parties. So it's up to them. And Red Football, because it's based in the UK, the exchange losses that we often see in terms of Manchester United's debt, that doesn't appear because that's dealt with externally. Some of the costs of running the PLC itself. If you're going to have your shares traded in New York, then you're going to have a setup there. Well, those costs are not being borne by Red Football, and rightly so. That is for the shareholders to sort out. The £34 million that it cost Manchester United PLC to sell a proportion of the shares to Jim Ratcliffe. Those costs are not being borne by the UK company because it's nothing to do with the UK. So you put all of these things through, and there's probably, over the course of a 12-month period, you're probably talking about a saving of 60 to 70 million. You do that for a couple of years, and all of a sudden Manchester United's finances, and I've been as guilty of this in the past as anybody else, because we all look at this. Manchester United on the website just talks about the PLC, but as far as its relationship with the Premier League is concerned, for PSR reasons, and that's all we care about because we're just interested in it from a transfer point of view, they're in a far, far better position.
Just on the Cayman Islands stuff, because obviously you hear the phrase Cayman Islands, you think, I mean, I don't even know if this is true, but the words tax haven jump to mind. I don't even really know what a tax haven is and if the Cayman Islands even is one. But how is it possible that the Cayman Islands somehow have supposedly Manchester United is a business of the Cayman Islands? Who is that? Is that just a loophole? Who are we trying to fool here? Because I don't see anything to do with Manchester United happening in the Cayman Islands. Or is there, and I don't know about it? Is it literally just a tax thing, or somehow do you have to prove that something is taking place in the Cayman Islands to do it this way?
No, nothing's happening there. You've got a nameplate. You've literally got a listed name on a door. If you go to Google Maps, you can probably find the address, and you go, well, this looks like a solicitor's office or something like that, or a boring place. If we go back to when Manchester United announced that it was going to go back onto the stock exchange, before the Glazers, Manchester United was traded on the London Stock Exchange, so no need for Cayman Islands. The Glazers didn't want Manchester United to be seen necessarily as a sports company or even an entertainment company. They've tried to revise the perception of the market about Manchester United as being a tech company. And if they get the tech bits right, the Manchester United share price will go into the stratosphere. But everybody's trying to do that at present. So therefore, by going to New York and effectively having a fresh start, it's a bit like you've had a relationship, it's not worked out. You don't want to be in the same town as your ex, so therefore you move
Yeah.
on elsewhere. And the American market is probably a bit more sympathetic to the Glazers than the degree of scrutiny that they would have got in London. Why is it in the Cayman Islands? There are benefits. I mean, Roman Abramovich used to lend money to Chelsea from a company in the British Virgin Islands. We've got other companies, other clubs who again have got BVI and Cayman Islands. There's less people sticking their nose into your affairs there. There are some potential tax advantages, but let's deal with those when you start to make some money. Let's face it, United have not been making money for a few years.
That's true, yeah.
So it's something it's something to beat the club over the head with as much as anything else. But there's loads and loads of companies do it, so they're doing nothing wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just going to say, do all clubs do this? I know obviously not all clubs are listed on the New York Stock Exchange, so they wouldn't necessarily have to have these workarounds. But essentially, all big companies and all, certainly top flight football teams are big companies. Is everyone kind of doing what they can and pinching here and hiding things there and all that? Is that what everyone does?
Not everyone, but Chelsea have done it. I think Bournemouth were doing it. If it's one of those things that if I've got a list of 50 things to do, which I normally have at the start of each day on Football Finance, finding out where they're all registered and some of them are registered. It's a bit like the gambling sponsors of all of these companies. They're all registered in the Isle of Man, which again is offshore, bit less scrutiny. Jim Ratcliffe's got his investment company based in the Isle of Man. People just want they want a bit of privacy. They're aware that football comes with a far greater degree of scrutiny than any other industry in this country. So they try to push back on that by keeping their affairs elsewhere.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's one of those things that just it feels like not normal people, maybe that's harsh, but people who would just sort of go to the work, get a job, get your money, don't ever think of how they could be manipulating these things or using the Cayman Islands or this. Maybe they would have no need to, but it all just feels like, right, that's what rich people do, and I guess you just sort of leave them to it in a way. I don't know. Just you mentioned before, I think it was 140, 150 were the numbers you quoted in terms of United's sort of spending power this summer. Obviously, that changes if United sell players. That's the big thing here, getting people out the door. How much or how hard will it be from a finance perspective, a PSR perspective, to get rid of the likes of Rashford and Sancho and Antony? Not from our standpoint, but the general sort of football landscape at the moment. People don't want to take on footballers on 300 grand a week or 40-50 million pound signings, especially outside of England. Do you think United are going to have a real problem trying to sell those players I mentioned there, Rashford, Sancho and Antony in particular?
If the players are good, if the players have performed well, there will be a market for them. So it's not impossible. I think in the case of Manchester United, many people see Manchester United as a destination club in the sense that Manchester United for a player, along with the likes of Real Madrid as well, is if that club comes interested in you, that's a real vote of confidence in you as a professional player. So whereas if you're supporting another club, let's say you're supporting Bournemouth or Palace or Brighton, and a club comes in for you, the player's more likely to leave because it's seen as a step up. Well, there's not many step ups from Manchester United, so it does make it slightly more complicated in that manner. There's a second issue, and I think you raised this validly here, Joe. Manchester United are generous payers. They've now got, I think, the third highest wage bill in the Premier League. And let's be brutal. If they'd won a few more competitions, if they'd qualified for Europe last year, their wage bill would have been much higher. If they got into the Champions League, because it's the pay structure is very much incentivized, as it is at other clubs as well. So that's the position in which we find ourselves. But even without those benefits, Manchester United, based on my figures, they're still probably averaging 150, 160 grand a week. And we know that Marcus Rashford, because he's come through the academy and because he was in a strong negotiating position, he just had a fantastic season when his contract was renegotiated, is on considerably more than that. So how many clubs in the world are willing to match those wages? Very, very few. Is there a workaround with that? Well, the player might decide for the benefit of their career that they're willing to take a pay cut. The player might be willing to go out on loan again. And sometimes you'll even see a 2-year loan with the host club, with Manchester United subsidising those wages. Or sometimes you've got the opportunity to go to places like the Saudi Pro League for which money isn't that much of an issue. But as we saw with Bruno Fernandes, even though he was offered, by all accounts, an eye-watering sum of money, he preferred to play his career there. So there's downsides. Jordan Henderson didn't last very long in Saudi. There's cultural differences. There's the standard of play businesses. If you're used to playing in front of 75,000 United fans, it's a bit of a step down if you go into a different market with far lower crowds.
You mentioned there about the wages and the loans and these sort of obligations or options to buy that seem to be more and more common in the last few years, especially at the top level. It felt like top teams or, the European sort of challenging teams didn't really loan players. And maybe that's just my perception of things. But is that a change that we've seen in finances and how tight everything is financially now, that we are seeing more big names being loaned around? Because I feel like early 2000s, sort of pre-FFP, you didn't really see Man United loaning players out or, top teams loaning players out. Is that a new thing? Or not new, obviously, but is that a result and a response to the financial sort of landscape at the minute?
Yes, 20 years ago, you could afford to lose a lot of money. You've only got to see what happened to Chelsea when Abramovich arrived and when Manchester City were acquired by Sheikh Mansour. Manchester City lost just under £200 million in a single season. But it was pre-FFP, so therefore wasn't an issue. Now clubs have to box clever. They're aware of PSR, that they're aware of the degree of forensic detail that the Premier League and the other institutions and UEFA will be going into in terms of their finances. So therefore, there's a greater incentive to free up cash by loaning players out. Just across the road, I think everybody's expecting Jack Grealish to leave City this summer, most probably on loan, because I can't see many people wanting to pay the City contract that he's got to somebody that's 29 years old who's not had a good couple of seasons now. Yeah. So therefore, you find that what the selling club will do, for want of a better phrase, will say, well, it's better that we pay 50% of the wages and we don't have a player who's moping around the training because he's miserable because he's not getting in the squad, compared to the alternative. So if we're just paying 50% of the wages and he's off playing elsewhere, and also if you arrange the loan deal, of course, so that the player can't play against your club. If Marcus Rashford has a fantastic second half of the season, he can play against everybody apart from Manchester United, as we saw last season, and he can do damage to them. So to a certain extent, he's acting on favour of Manchester United if the player rediscovers their form.
This is just a general question. I've been meaning to ask this for about 18 months. I didn't hear the phrase PSR until maybe 2 years ago. It was FFP. That was what everyone was saying. Are they the same thing? And if not, why have we transitioned from FFP being the buzzword or the buzz acronym to now PSR being the thing that everyone says? What is the difference?
Yeah, it's a bit like a marathon bar becoming a Snickers. It's quite similar to that, in the sense that if you get the phrase financial fair play, people start saying, okay, well, what's fair about it? And then they realise that there's nothing fair about it. And even UEFA, if you look at the UEFA handbook, I don't recommend it, by the way, but if you read the UEFA handbook from cover to cover, they say the aim is not to try to create a level playing field. But I think that's what many people perceived through the word fair. Right. It was to give other clubs a chance because we did have an established European elite. So therefore, they changed the name, and I think that the new phrase is just as bad, because the rules don't encourage profitability, as we've seen with Chelsea selling the women's team to itself and selling hotels and car parks. That's not profitable. And also,
Absurd.
because you're still allowed to lose 105, so the actual numbers in FFP transitioning to PSR, those numbers haven't changed. It doesn't encourage sustainability as well, because the clubs are still being subsidised in the main by owners.
So you don't need to have profit, you don't need to be sustainable, and by the looks of what's going on with Man City, you don't need to follow the rules either. That's so the PSR is being sort of flouted all around town. I want to talk about City actually in a minute. There's just another thing on the PSR thing. You're not a Manchester United fan, and we obviously speak to most of the United fans. We're all Man United fans on the channel here.
Absolutely, yeah.
I see this strange split between people saying that PSR was designed by the top six, the big six, to keep them rich, to stop anyone else sort of entering that sphere and challenging the established elite. And yet, on the other hand, I feel you look at like some Man City and Chelsea and maybe even United now, Newcastle, they would be spending a lot more than they currently do if it weren't for PSR. How do you see that as someone that doesn't support Man United or one of the top six teams, or the big six teams as they were once called? Do you think it is an attempt at the elite to hold on to their power, or do you think that it's sort of curtailing everyone's spending almost sort of across the board?
But you're a young man, Joe. You're probably too young to remember this, but you think about the first 10, 12 years of the Premier League. United won it 7 times out of 10. Arsenal won it on a couple of occasions, and we had Blackburn as well. So United were the dominant club. Then along came Abramovich, and he upset the apple cart. David Dean, the former Arsenal chairman, said he woke up one morning and there was Roman Abramovich in a tank firing £50 notes across his lawn, and all of a sudden Chelsea had the biggest budget. Then Mansour came along with City, and all of a sudden City had the biggest budget. So I think the clubs who had been used to qualifying for the Champions League and used to making significant progress in the Champions League says, well, this could happen another 3 or 4 times. What happens if Saudi Arabia acquires a football club, or Qatar acquires a football club in England, and so on? Does this mean that this could be repeated? So I think there is a case for saying that the existing successful clubs didn't want another Chelsea or another Manchester City. And to a certain extent, I think we've seen that with the takeover of Newcastle. If they'd wanted to, Newcastle could spend 500 million a year on new players. If PIF said, this is what we want to do, they could have done that if we didn't have some form of cost control rules. So, I mean, Newcastle have been successful. Newcastle, in my view, have bought really smart. And that's why they qualified for 2 years out of 3 in the Champions League. But they could have bought a hell of a lot more. I mean, they've not spent anything for 3 windows. They could have spent a hell of a lot more had the rules not been there. And therefore, perhaps they would have been challenging for the Premier League title in the last couple of years as a result of that.
Yeah, it does make sense, and I do think there's definitely an element of like what you've said. I mean, you know more than me about it, so I sort of concede to your judgment there. I do think though that it's hard to consider and to take into account nation states with unlimited wealth coming into football and the effect that has, because that is a completely different thing than we've seen in the 130, 40 years of football up until Abramovich, and then, like I said, Sheikh Mansour, and then the Newcastle takeover. To go to the next step of people with literally hundreds of billions, maybe even trillions of pounds in wealth, being able to spend at will, that kind of seems like it would take football in another direction entirely. Sorry to just dwell on the PSR thing. It feels insane to me that United and other clubs, we've got Garnacho being one of the names touted as leaving Man United, and maybe the way that's evolved, actually, he would leave regardless of being a pure profit academy player, because he seems to have fallen out with the manager. But it seems a shame to me that clubs almost use and are encouraged to use young players from around Europe, around the world, as these kind of the bedrock to your financial stability. You have to buy them in for 500 grand, sell them for 5 million, do that 10 times, and you can spend 250 million on the first team. Chelsea are the perfect example of that. How can we change PSR? Do you have any ideas of tweaks or maybe wholesale changes that could be made where young footballers aren't seen as pawns in a financial kind of circus? Not that pawns are in circuses, but you know what I mean. And that also we aren't selling car parks to ourselves, stadiums to ourselves, women's teams to ourselves. These farcical things that people are doing to get around these rules. Is there a way, do you think, where they can still, help football not be this absolute, farce of nation states spending trillions, but also stay within the rules of what we think football should be?
Yeah, I mean, the Premier League club chief executives had an opportunity last week to address some of these issues, because the car park sales, the hotel sales, the women's team sales, they're not allowed under UEFA rules. The player swaps that we saw 12 months ago, when you had Chelsea and Villa and Everton and Forest and Newcastle, all sort of just having this sort of ping pong game of players moving. I've never heard of him. How's he worth 20 mil? And so on. And there was the transactions operating in both. That could have been addressed, and it has been addressed by UEFA. UEFA are independent of the clubs to a far greater extent than the Premier League. So, Richard Masters and his team, and I know he's a guy that comes in for a lot of stick, and you can understand why. They are keen to change the rules, but you need 14 clubs to vote for them. And it didn't even get as far as a vote. There was a quick sort of, look, this is what we're thinking of doing. Could you just have what's the thing? What's the response of clubs? And what the clubs are saying, we don't like what Chelsea have done, but we don't want Chelsea to be the only. If Chelsea do it and the other clubs can't, it actually gives Chelsea an advantage. So clubs therefore want to be able to use the sale of the women's teams and the car parks as a get out of jail free card if they've got a PSR problem. And it's much better than selling a player. With regards to selling academy players, there is you could come up with some sort of little formula based on the number of on the player's wages, or when he was leaving, to put a nominal fee. Let's say that for every 10 grand a week the player was on, he's deemed to be worth £5 million. You can come up with a sort of solution to this, which would stop clubs. Chelsea and Manchester City have both been brilliant at doing it. You look at the Chelsea figures; they've generated, based on my figures, just shy of £800 million worth of profits in the last decade from the sale of players. And it's Tomori, Tammy Abrahams, Conor Gallagher, Mason Mount, Billy Gilmore, Gahey, and they're brilliant at spotting these players as well. You got to give them credit for it. And then but you're absolutely right, Joe. That emotional bond that you as a United fan have with all of those players who have come through and graced the pitch at Old Trafford, which isn't, you still love the other players, but there's something special, as we both know, about one of our own. To now see football players, to see young men being treated as profit centres, it's a bit grubby, it's a bit tawdry, but it works as far as the clubs are concerned, and therefore they ain't. Turkeys don't vote for Christmas. Clubs aren't going to change the rules willingly.
No, and it seems as though we saw with Manchester City and their spending when they had their takeover, and that seemed to spark this whole FFP revolution. At least in my eyes, I mean, I might be wrong there. It seemed like that was the time when that all kicked off. Then we saw this Chelsea giving out 9-year contracts, and I think we saw the amortisation rules be sort of reined in a little bit as well, in terms of the amount of time you can spread a deal over. Now we've got this next step of the car parks, the women's teams, the sale of assets to yourself thing. United are never doing these things. Is that because we're stupid? Are we trying to stay away from 115 charges slapped across our desk like Man City have seen? Because it seems like some teams are really willing to push, be right on that line, maybe even a toe across the line in terms of what's allowed and what isn't. And it feels like United, across the last sort of 15 years at least, whether it's a lack of creativity, whether we're trying to be a bit more, a bit more virtuous, which is obviously a ridiculous thing to say because I don't, assume United care about that sort of stuff particularly. Why do you think Man United have seemed to have done less of these sort of wheeler-dealer dodgy tactics when it comes to FFP and stuff than other clubs?
I think you could be the first person in Manchester United history to call the Glazers virtuous there, Joe.
No, I wasn't calling the Glazers virtuous. let's correct that. But you understand what I mean? Though we sort of stay way away from that line when everyone else knows what they're doing.
Okay, because it's Manchester United. Manchester United have been generating so much revenue over the course of that day. Yeah, you think about last season. Yeah, I've just had these. Yeah, we just had these accounts come through. Manchester United last season, or sorry, in the first three quarters, spent £272 million signing players. And that's to the 31st of March. So that doesn't include the Kuna deal. It doesn't include what might happen with Mbeumo and so on. And the previous season, it was 208. So Manchester United has managed to actually buy players on a regular basis because they are the most attractive brand to sponsors. They are the most attractive club as far as the broadcasters are concerned. So therefore, they get the benefits from it because they have made progress. We know we had Manchester United had a bad season last season. They've still won 5 cups in the last 10 years. I think there is, and I know that the standards at Manchester United are so high that people's expectations are that much greater. But making progress in those competitions, having 75,000, 74,000 people turn up every week at Old Trafford, that generates the money. Whereas Chelsea have got a capacity of 41,000. So they generate far less money from ticket sales than Manchester United do. Manchester United haven't needed to go down that route because they are superbly successful at generating money. This is sort of a football issue rather than a football finance issue. They're pretty crap at spending it. Yeah. And that's why we're sort of having this discussion.
Yeah, and that's one thing we can definitely agree on, that the Glazers have been absolutely crap at spending the money that they've had, or employing the people to spend the money that they've earned. Just finally, and it is a sort of it's a non-United question. What is going on with these Man City charges? Because when this came in, it was like 3-4 years ago now. We were all so excited. They might get relegated. We might get an extra title for Solskjaer. Who knows what the future could hold for Manchester United? Or was it Jose Mourinho in 2018? This could be the best thing ever. Now it's like, how is something that's so exciting? Obviously, it's not exciting for City fans, but what's going on? This trial's ended. It's been months and months. Why do you think it's taken so long to hear the results of these Man City charges?
Well, if we take a look at what happened with the Nottingham Forest and the Everton commissions, they covered effectively a single charge looking at a 3-year FFP or PSR issue. And I think in the case of Everton, there were 50,000 pieces of evidence that were submitted by both parties. The accusations against Manchester City cover a period of 9 years. And they also cover a much, much broader range of charges. Effectively, they've been accused of corporate fraud. And that's far more serious than in the case of Forest, well, we would have complied, but we wanted to hold on to Brennan Johnson for another few weeks because we thought we'd get a better price. Now, that was the crux of the Forest idea. And then Forest said, guilty as charged. Now, Manchester City haven't done that. They've come out all guns blazing as far as the charges are concerned. So you're probably looking at something like 500,000 pieces of evidence. It's got to be, the case itself took ages. And I think we've just now been through the 6-month barrier in terms of the times it's taken to put together a verdict. There are sort of practical complications. The 3 people on the commission, they're very high profile, they're very busy. So actually people think, well, are they looking at the evidence every day for the next 6 months? No, because they've got other work commitments. So that's an issue. It's clearly not a slam dunk. It's clearly not an open and shut case. So therefore they've got to get the verdict right. And there is nothing being leaked. I talk to people in football, you talk to people, nobody's got a Scooby as to what the verdict's going to be. And one of my fears is that some of the evidence they would have wanted to get, they wouldn't necessarily have been able to get. So I think, for example, one of the accusations that's been made against Manchester City is that Roberto Mancini was getting £2 million for 4 days' work in Abu Dhabi on top of his £2 million from City from being the manager. If he declares that on his tax return, there's nothing wrong with that. And part of me says, look, Joe, if the Stretford Paddock Saudi branch asks you to go across for 4 days and they'll pay you £2 million for 4 days, you'll give it a thought. You'll give it some serious consideration. So I'm not having to go at the manager for that. But he could quite happily say to the commission, because he's got no legal powers, I'm not prepared to give evidence to you. And equally, if they were trying to get information, if they were trying to get witnesses to come from Abu Dhabi, what happens if they turn around and say, no, we've taken legal advice, we don't want to give evidence? And it makes it that much more difficult to come to a verdict on which you've got that proof. And if you're being accused of corporate fraud, then you've got to have a hell of a lot of proof in order to be found guilty. So that is causing the delay. From what I understand, is that when the verdict does come out, the Premier League and Manchester City will probably be given a 24-hour heads up from the rest of us. And that's right and proper. That allows the Premier League legal team and Manchester City's legal team to take a look at the pronouncements of the Commission. And they might just go back with some technical queries and so on. Then we'll get the verdict as to whether they're guilty or not guilty. But you won't necessarily find out the punishment. It could be that the Commission says, right, they're guilty of this 42, or they're guilty of this 12, or they're guilty of 115, or they're guilty of 0. And we now want another couple of weeks before we work out what the appropriate punishment is. And that's you do see. So it's going to be a pain over the course of the summer, because nobody knows what's going on.
Do you think they potentially wait until the end of the Club World Cup? Because obviously that's such a huge, well, they're very much trying to make this a huge thing, aren't they? FIFA and the rest of the team and Manchester City are involved in that. Do you think that could be anything to do with it? Or, I mean, it's just speculation, isn't it?
No, I think the legal people involved in the Commission, they don't give a hoot about what's happening in terms of on the pitch issues. So it could be brought out the day of the final for all they care. You know, they just want to get on with doing their job as being legal experts and weighing up the evidence from both parties.
And just lastly, I know this is, sorry, we've kept you a long time here, but it's great chatting to you about all this stuff. Just finally, do you know, when it comes to sort of criminal cases and civil cases, you hear two phrases. One is beyond reasonable doubt, and the other is balance of probability, which is, I mean, you'll probably know more about this than me, but beyond reasonable doubt basically means you have to show really great evidence beyond reasonable doubt that someone committed a crime. That, you know, is there any doubt in your mind? Is there a reasonable doubt? Then they're innocent. Whereas balance of probabilities is which is more likely of the two. Are these phrases that will be used in this case, which one will be used, or is it a completely different set of proof burden compared to a typical civil or criminal suit? Basically, how guilty does City have to be for them to get a guilty verdict? You know what I'm saying, don't you?
Yeah. I mean, this is not governed by UK law. As somebody that's been on jury service, effectively what you are told, it is better for one guilty person to go free than 100 not guilty people. No, sorry, I got it the wrong way around. It's better for it's better that you let people go who are guilty rather than imprisoning people who are not guilty. And therefore, that's why we have this beyond reasonable doubt. So therefore, if you ever do jury service, you've got to have a unanimous verdict and things like this. Whereas I think in a civil case, the balance of probabilities, it's a 51 to 49. As far as this commission is concerned, I think in terms of the accusations of corporate fraud, which are forming part of the charges, and why I say it's corporate fraud, it's that the accusation is that Manchester City have disguised money from the owner by pretending it to be sponsors, and then completely denied that. So that is, I think, the burden of proof there that the commission would be expecting would have to be very high, because you're talking about people's reputations. You're talking about people's professional position, and we're talking about big institutions. Manchester City and some of the sponsors involved are big institutions back in Abu Dhabi, and City, are a big club as far as their finances are concerned. So that's why I suspect they will be looking for a fairly overwhelming conclusion in terms of whether City are guilty of those or not.
Okay, brilliant. Right, well, hopefully we can get some clarity on that soon. Thank you so much for coming on, as always. We've kept you almost 40 minutes there. It's been great chatting to you about United summer. And weirdly, even though there's all this sort of unusual business with wages being lower because we're not in the Europa or in the Champions League, players wanting to leave, how hard it is to sell players, it felt like an overall a quite positive chat about Man United's finances there for once, which very, very good to have indeed. Thank you very much, Kieran.
Well, thanks for the invite as always, Joe. Yeah, they were probably never as bad as people feared. Yeah, and again, it's a function of Manchester United. They are the biggest club in terms of generating noise. So a small throwaway comment all of a sudden becomes amplified, and it runs with itself because it generates media interest, it generates clicks online and so on, and the narrative can somewhat sort of disappear from the reality. So yeah, these figures they're okay. Manchester United, there's some really good things in the sense that they're paying less than half their incomes going out in the form of wages. That gives them a bit of wiggle room going forwards. Yes, they owe a lot of money in terms of existing transfers, not denying that, but the fact that they spent 272 million this year, it shows that they've got the potential to still spend big next year as well.
Great. Right. Thank you very much, Kieran. Make sure you check out Kieran on the Price of Football podcast. We'll also put a link to his social media in the comments below as well. Thank you, as always, for coming on, Kieran. Thank you for joining us at home. We'll see you in a bit.